Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Jen and I have been talking about getting me involved in a Code for America event for many years now, since the very beginning. And I've finally taken a break from this book that I'm writing about smart cities, so I was able to join you all. What I want to talk about is this growing buzz all around the world, of which Code for America is a very important, but just a single piece, about the opportunity to use technology to fix cities. And it goes by a bunch of different names, some of which are trademarked, actually. Smarter cities, intelligent urbanization. I think this group likes to call it civic tech. I like just plain old smart cities. It's very simple, and it gets to the essence of what I'm interested in. And so about 2 years ago, I started working on this book, just trying to understand, what is all this buzz about? And I wasn't so much interested in the what of the technology so much as I was the where, the who, the why, and the how. And like a lot of projects and a lot of people who've gotten involved in this movement, I see around this room, this man played a really important role in getting that book started. Benjamin de la Peña, the Rockefeller Foundation. And Benjamin, I think, is as excited and was as excited about these technologies as we are. But he was also very, very deeply concerned about what all the new tech and software and data flooding into cities meant for the poor. Because he had seen many examples of where things, not just things that were sort of accidentally done that harmed the poor, but things that were specifically done to help the poor, like the Bhumi land registry system in India, which was meant to empower people who had lived on land for generations to acquire formal title to that land, but actually had empowered speculators all over the world who were assembling that land into parcels and pushing people off land they'd lived on for a very long time. And he's a very persuasive guy. And by the time I left his office, he had persuaded me to, not to do that, I hate these things, to develop the forecast that Jack talked about, this graphical view of the future called a Planet of Civic Laboratories. And what this was a celebration of this potential for local innovation. I've been hearing a lot about, one technology that works in one city can work in any other city, and I didn't believe that was true. I believe the real story was actually what's bubbling up from the grassroots. And it was very optimistic, but it also focused on these systemic dilemmas and challenges of building smart cities, and that was a really different take on things, because if you listen to many of the experts out there who are talking about smart cities and talking about technology, they're talking about how awesome they are, how high-tech, how incredibly fine-tuned you can make a city as a machine like a Formula One race car. And this is what Carlo Ratti at MIT likes to talk about. If you trick a city out with sensors, you'll be able to stream enough real-time data into the cloud, and then the cloud analytics will bring intelligence, and that will overcome all of the structural problems of government. Industry has been pushing this forward as well. IBM has launched a global marketing campaign over the last few years to really educate the public and educate civic leaders about what's possible. But their message is often that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can keep living this very convenient, energy-intensive lifestyle, and our buildings will just bring down their own energy costs without us having to do anything. And we'll be able to see traffic jams before we even get in our cars, so we won't have to worry about congestion. Wow, that's pretty cool stuff. And if you're a mayor walking through an airport and you see that, and maybe there's an election looming in the near future, you think to yourself, this is pretty cool. I need to get some of this. And in fact, that's what's happening all over the world. We go down to places like Rio de Janeiro, which is running up to 2 major global events, the World Cup and the Olympics in 2016. And Mayor Eduardo Paez brought in IBM to build this massive command bunker filled with people and computers and maps. Thousands of video feeds from cameras and all the city buses. And they're all displayed on what the city's infomercial describes as the biggest screen in Latin America, as if that's some kind of measure of good governance. Even in places where mayors don't have to run for election, like in China, you see Cisco at the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai, showing off their vision of a control panel, a holographic system that allows city managers to stand like gods on Mount Olympus and look down and push us around and change the path of our lives. And you talk to people in industry, and they are happy to admit that they're bringing value by taking the same systems that they developed for global corporations, logistics, customer relationship management, analytics, and just porting them over to government. Because government works just like business, right? We all know that. Absolutely not. And one of the things that's, I think, preposterous about all these images is that there's no citizens in them. Citizens are not employees. Citizens are not customers. They're different kinds of beings. And given the slightest chance, they will screw all of your well-laid plans up. You can't install a smart city from the top down and expect people to live with it, especially if it's going to take power away from them, which I suspect many of these command centers are going to. You have to engage them to grow up from the bottom up. Or at least this was my hunch. And the reason I had this hunch is because we've been through this before. In the 1950s and the 1960s, when we started ramming expressways through cities, people like Robert Moses, technocratic urban planners, he actually proposed to build a superhighway through Greenwich Village and Soho. And if you go to, if you were in New York in the 1950s, you think, oh, well, it's sort of blighted, maybe that's a good idea. But there were people who were living there who didn't think that was a good idea. He was reshaping New York City around visions that had originally come to light in the 1939 World's Fair. And General Motors put on this amazing exhibition called Futurama that sort of showed what America would look like if we organized it around the car. And so I have to ask myself, are the mayors of Rio and Shanghai paving the way for the visions of technology companies? I don't know. The technologies are very different, but bottom line, I don't like the way they've been going about it. I think leaving citizens out of the process of designing the technology, picking the technology, implementing it, setting yourself up for these terrible, terrible misguided mistakes. And in fact, that's what happened in New York in the 60s. People like Jane Jacobs, they organized and they stopped the highways. They fought the planners' big data with their own crowdsourced big data. And they didn't stop there. They actually emasculated the entire profession and establishment of city planning, from which it has still not recovered. But in its wake, they suggested a new approach to planning cities, one that embraced citizens as valued stakeholders, sources of new ideas, even as implementers of big plans. Now, some in the urban planning profession are bemoaning the fact that we're not really able to make big plans anymore. Places like Mission Bay are hard. They take decades. They take tremendous political capital to marshal. It's tough for us to build big for the future. And I also think that not everything has to come from the grassroots. But I think if we start to think about building smart cities less like a mainframe and build them more like the web, we'll be better off. And I don't think we have a choice, because you look around the world and these two frameworks are coming to blows. And they're playing out within a much bigger struggle over control of the city between people and their governments that's literally being waged in the streets with technological measures and countermeasures. Social media, mobile communications, video surveillance, facial recognition, encryption. And you see the same tactics actually used by government, like blocking out cell phone networks to kind of lobotomize the smart mob that's protesting something in Cairo, as you do in San Francisco's BART system. And you are all in the middle. This is your job to avoid this battle. You have to understand what citizens want, what businesses need, what both sides can supply in terms of solutions, and how to mitigate the unintended consequences of this transformation. I think we have a pretty good sense now of what the top-down approach offers. It offers efficiency, it offers security, and it offers convenience. But this grassroots citizen side of smart cities technology, it's a lot messier. It involves a lot of the things that people have already spoken about today, like open data. It involves apps and all of the incredibly resourceful developers that are taking advantage of government data or scraping their own data off the web or having citizens crowdsource data too. It involves DIY sensor networks like the air quality egg, which is being pushed forward by the public laboratory, and building an incredible network of air quality monitoring stations using simple open source hardware technology. And of course, it involves crowdsourcing. It's millions of inventors all over the world. There's 500,000 local governments in the world, and every one of them potentially is a source of a novel innovation. These people, I think, instead of efficiency, they're pursuing opportunities for sociability, ways to connect to other people. Instead of control and security, they're interested in transparency. They're interested in fun. And so I've been struggling for frameworks to understand what all this means, because it's not really a movement yet. And I went looking for some guides. And if you go back to 1970 Silicon Valley, you find this thing that could only happen in California as far as I'm concerned. It's called the People's Computer Club. And they had this great newsletter, which was like a clipper ship sailing off into the sunset of some utopia where the age of the mainframe is gone and personal computers are here, and we all had this radically democratized technology. It's a lot like the things that we're talking about here with data and all the other technologies that you're working with. But my favorite part is their motto, sort of a perfect description for, I think, what I was seeing in these top-down smart cities. They said, computers are mostly used against people instead of for people, used to control people instead of to free them. Time to change all that. We need a people's computer company. Kind of inspirational. But I don't think it was enough. So I dug deeper and actually went back to the very origins of urban planning, which you may not know were in Scotland at the turn of the century in the city of Edinburgh. And I found this freak, Patrick Geddes. Now, aside from pioneering the study of how sex is a mechanism for encouraging genetic diversity, he got bored with that. He was an evolutionary biologist. And he got really concerned about what was happening in the cities of Britain at the time. Industrialization. This is the same thing that's happening in China, India, and Brazil, and Africa right now. Just terrible growth causing terrible problems, and governance can't keep up. So he helped found the field of sociology. And he was actually one of the first people to holistically look at cities as entire regions that encompassed also the nature around them. And he brought his biologist sensibility to these endeavors. He had one of the richest understandings of cities of anybody I've encountered in all my studies. At one point in London in 1904, he said, "A city is not a place in space. It is a drama in time." And I always use that as a way of thinking about cities. Cities are stories. They're not buildings. Even as his contemporaries, men like Ebenezer Howard, who you see here, who was developing what he called the Garden City template. This is the precursor to modern suburbia. Howard just wanted to leave the problems of the city behind and build new cities around a utopian ideal. Others were proposing to just clear massive swaths of slums in London and other cities. Geddes instead took his new wife, they had just gotten married, bought a whole top floor of a tenement house in one of Edinburgh's worst neighborhoods and moved in and began studying. He began buying up property and renovating buildings. He was actually a gardener, and so he felt he was gardening the city back to life. And he prefigured the entire civic tech movement today, the whole emphasis on crowdsourcing. He believed that the only way to fix the city was to make sure that every single last person was recruited in the effort. And he believed that they needed to understand the city and where it had come from and what its problems were. So he built this thing called the Outlook Tower in downtown Edinburgh. It was an immersion center to teach people about this field he was developing of applied sociology, taking everything that we knew about how societies worked and using it to sort of scientifically approach the problems of city. And he called this field civics. And I started to wonder, what would a civics for smart cities look like? If I asked any one of you here, I think you'd probably say, well, it means participation. And we've got these great tools, like the one that I used here to report this pothole in Hoboken, New Jersey, which 30 other people had reported. It's more than just participation, though. And it's more than just the individual code of conduct that we learn, in middle school. And for Geddes, it meant a lot more. It meant drawing on everything we know, sociology, economics, law, political science, and just plain common sense to engage everyone around problem solving. And so this is sort of where my book has ended up, with 13 tenets of a new civics for smart cities. And I just have a few minutes left, and I'm just going to run through them quickly. I think the first thing is, even as excited as we are about technology, we have to realize that it's not the answer to everything. If you believe people like Christopher Alexander, the architect who sort of reigned over Berkeley's planning department for many years, every urban problem has already been solved. We just have to apply the good solutions that people figured out, hundreds of years ago, building, small public spaces and integrating work and housing and so forth. And often technology creates more problems than it solves. So I think you need to I tried to sort of like frame this in a constructive way. I think you want to opt into smart, that there's always other tools out there. Technology is just one piece of it. Oh, yeah, and that was my keynote animation. It's the first one I've ever done, so. The second tenet, roll your own broadband. Why any city in America is not investing in fiber right now, to me, is absolutely insane. European cities have considered it a no-brainer. Thanks. If you go to, I was in Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova, which is the absolute poorest country in Europe, Eastern Europe. 2 years ago, it had cheaper, better residential broadband, competitive, than you have in San Francisco today. And that's something that needs to get fixed fast. I don't mean to pick on San Francisco, but we're fighting against the telecom industry, they're lobbyists, they're not investing in infrastructure. And there's a handful of cities, I think, that are starting to break through. Chattanooga now is moving boldly into the future with its electric power authority. There's very viable business models there, and the economic benefits are almost unmeasurable. This is kind of a subtle point about how industry is approaching smart cities. Everywhere you look, someone's trying to become the Microsoft, trying to figure out how they can become the middleware layer that everybody has to deal with for every transaction in the city. The most nefarious is this Portuguese-based group called Living Planet. They've trademarked the term urban operating system, and they think, in the words of one executive, that it will control everything that happens in the city. I don't think anybody wants to build a city, at least in the United States, like that. Now, standards are important, and when I interviewed Jennifer Palka last year for my book, she made this very important point. The standards are important so that cities can collaborate without having to talk about it all the time. They can work around a common base of assumptions. I agree, and I think we need to set them more like we set the standards on the web. Open, voluntary, free, ad hoc, and very loosely coupled. This is a picture of Daniel Sarasa, who was one of you guys in Zaragoza, Spain's 5th largest city. He's an aide to the mayor and runs a project called Digital Mile. And this is a smart card that they've developed. In less than a year, they've signed up about 1/4 of the population, 250,000 people. And this lets you do anything. It's a passport to the city. You can check a book out of the library. You can log on to the public Wi-Fi network. You can pay for a bus. You can unlock a bike share, and so forth. It is generating a tremendous amount of data about how people use that city. And the thing that struck me about talking to him is that he doesn't see that as a risky thing for the city, which I think many of you would probably see. Oh, all this citizen data, I've got to be concerned about how I handle it. He's actually embracing that, and they're thinking about how they can extend that stewardship role to other kinds of data that get collected in the city, and even in some ways start to act as a buffer between citizens and some of the parties that are sensing them to try and create value out of that. And I think that's a really interesting model. But I think it raises this bigger question of how do you structure the public-private partnerships that revolve around smart cities? How much of your brains are you willing to outsource? Open data, this is a big deal. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation a few months ago and found that only about 6% of the US population lives in a municipality that has an open data, single open data repository. There's a lot of work to be done there, but I think in some ways, we're already moving on to the next transparency battle, which is about algorithms. This is not just the software that runs different pieces of urban infrastructure or operations, but the assumptions that are programmed into analytics and decision support tools. I think fear that we're already moving in the wrong direction. New York City passed this historic open data law this year. It was a remarkable accomplishment. Kicked the ball down the field for everybody several years. But it had one really, really important flaw in that it specifically exempted computer code from disclosure. And so the black boxes that are increasingly going to be helping us make decisions, if not making decisions, will be hidden from the public. And that's absolutely got to change. Graceful failure. This is a picture of Tokyo's Shibuya district, which usually looks like Times Square on steroids. Well, after the tsunami last year, it was blacked out. Now, in your city, all of this stuff is going to run over wireless networks. And when your cell networks go down because they lose power, they've got about 4 hours before, lights out, Internet of Things, game over. You've got to have backups. It's got to fail gracefully. Code for America is doing an amazing job, I think, circulating innovations between cities. Not just innovations, talent, actual working code. It's not just ideas, it's not just best practices. There are other groups that are doing the same thing globally. Living Labs Global, they're trying to figure out how you take a small firm in one city that has come up with the best parking app in the world and copy it to 100 other cities. That's a very hard thing to do. But the flow of innovations between cities is accelerating. It was accelerating before tech. It took 30 years for bus rapid transit to spread from Brazil to a handful of other cities. It took 5 years for bike sharing to spread from Paris all over the world. And now the kinds of things that you guys are working on can spread much more quickly. But the key thing to think about is, what do you tailor at home versus what do you import from other places? Red Burns, who founded the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU, it's kind of a media lab at NYU's art school, back in the early 80s described her mission. She said, "We're training a new kind of professional, one who's comfortable with both analytical and creative thinking." And I think our smart city designers and planners and policymakers need that mindset. But they also need to cross-train in both urbanism and cities and informatics. And I recognize a handful of people in the world today, some of their pictures are here, who are capable of doing that. And I think Code for America is creating these kind of people, and that's a wonderful thing. But we need to do more. We need to push this into grad schools and grade schools and let people know that that's important. Yes. So we're all, I think, very excited about the prospects of real-time data for operations, for management, for citizen engagement. But what about planning? How do you use real-time data to get people thinking about long-term issues? And I saw this and I thought, oh my God, this is real-time data being used to visualize the pain of a chronic problem, which is a lack of capital investment in transit infrastructure. This is going to create pressure for long-term fixes. And the idea that citizens are driving the initiation of a planning agenda is really novel. We're all excited about crowdsourcing, but this is tricky because it's a very fine line between crowdsourcing and privatization and gated communities that provide for themselves and exclude others. And I just like to think about this pamphlet from 1932, the New York Regional Plan Association published, and it was all just about crowds. And I love the page that said, some crowds are good, and some crowds are bad. So we need to keep that in mind as we think about crowdsourcing. Just a few more here. Connect everyone. This is kind of where I started with all this, and it absolutely goes without saying. But it's not just an access issue. So I've been really disturbed to find out in New York and Vancouver and every city that I've asked that's looked at it, that non-English speakers or non-native English speakers use 311 less than native English speakers. All right, if it's just an access issue, you do a PR campaign, you work with community leaders, you get those communities comfortable with using 311. But when it starts to become a really big problem is when people start using 311 data as a dashboard for where to allocate scarce city resources. Because it creates this loop where the people that complain the most get more resources and therefore get more out of government, reinforcing inequality. I think that's something we need to look deeper into. This is kind of a minor point. There's a lot of excitement about big data driving a new science of cities. And it's off to a very, very shaky start. 2010, Jonah Lehrer, who had some problems with plagiarism in the last few months, proclaimed on the front page of the New York Times Magazine that Jeffrey West is a physicist who has solved the city. And it was this very interesting thesis that cities actually get more efficient as they get bigger. And he had a lot of big data to support that. This idea has already been torn to pieces by his own colleagues for some basic statistical analysis errors. But he's continuing to push this message out there that one solution to urban problems is to get bigger. He just signed a $750,000 book deal with Penguin, which had a couple extra zeros compared to my book deal. But I think this is the promise of smart cities, is that even if none of this stuff works for operations management or planning, we're going to learn how cities work from all the data that's being collected by these tools. And if I can just end on this point, we love big data, But not all of the answers to our problems are going to be found in the data exhaust. And I had a young entrepreneur come into my office about a year ago with a proposal to reinvent lost and found. And we got talking, and we were thinking, the Internet of Things is going to be a great tool for lost and found, because you'll be able to find everything, anywhere, anytime. Just put a search appliance on it, and you're good to go. But what his solution was to make it social, make it a game, and really to create one bit of incredibly meaningful data, that this thing that you lost was found in this place by this person, and create this really intimate human experience around it. And so this is kind of a half-baked idea, this notion of slow data, data that lets us kind of re-engage our humanity and our surroundings as opposed to sweeping it under the rug with automation. And if I can just leave you, with one thought, I think Jane Jacobs said it best. She said, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And I hope that these things will help you guide you towards making that happen. Thank you.